The second major trend that I think is in the background is, as has been discussed, the ongoing diffusion of power from the traditional West to emerging economies and the huge geopolitical implications that go along with that. This trend is most obvious with the emergence of the BRICS, of course, but it goes much, much further than that. In 2011, developing countries, for the first time, account for more than 50% of global GDP. And it's scheduled to rise, or predicted to rise, to 60% by 2025. In 1990, OECD countries were responsible for 60% of global GDP, and by 2030, it's going to be half that, 30%, which will be about the same as the BRICS, according to current projections. And obviously, the result is a growing disconnect between the global distribution of power and the distribution of authority within traditional global institutions. Now, from the United States perspective, and perhaps from the wider West's perspective, the desire has been to somehow incorporate or integrate these countries as quote-unquote responsible stakeholders, to use the famous formulation that Robert Zoellick, then Deputy Secretary of State, made in 2005 with respect to China. The idea here is, in return for a place at the table and a growing voice, these countries might both embrace existing international norms and rules, but then also cooperate in the provision of global public goods. And it's a really nice and hopeful scenario from the perspective of the traditional West, but it runs into several problems, and I just want to name four of them. The first is that, and this came up again in some of Thierry's comments, it's not always clear that established and emerging powers share fundamental values or agree on the content of global norms, and they're disinclined to allow the West to set the terms of what responsibility means. The question is whose rules and whose values will govern, as these countries want to be rule makers as opposed to simply rule takers. The second major obstacle is that rising powers may be much more inclined to enjoy the prestige and benefits as major players than to contribute to global public goods. And this attitude is one that's reinforced by the status, self-declared status of many of these countries as developing countries, and thus countries that have enormous internal problems, which again gets in the way of the notion of collective leadership and burden sharing, at the same time that the United States and Europe, for reasons that have been discussed, are having difficulties exercising their traditional leadership. The third major obstacle is that existing institutions and regimes are notoriously resistant to change, in part due to the vested interests of existing power wielders. And a great case study in this is the International Energy Agency. The International Energy Agency's membership continues to be based, as you know, simply on OECD countries, with their share of voting within that organization pegged to the mid-1970s, their level of oil consumption in the mid-1970s. It's a bit problematic when you think that Western, or at least OECD oil consumption has been fairly static since that time, whereas it's increased in China and India by factors of 8 and 6-fold when those countries are not at the table. In addition, it can be very difficult to reform international institutions because there are often critical trade-offs between effectiveness, legitimacy, and like-mindedness. And we see this very much in debates between whether or not one should keep the G8 versus the G20, versus whether some sort of intermediate body that was still reasonably representative but more effective might have been the way to go. The most glaring example of institutional inertia has been and remains the UN Security Council, whose permanent membership has not changed since 1945. The fourth and final constraint is one that Charlie Kupchan and a number of other people have mentioned. This is a constraint on international governance or global governance, and that is domestic governance and the collision between the two of them. Globalization has complicated domestic politics and the domestic politics of multilateral policy coordination and global governance reform. And this is true of all states. Today's multilateral agenda is much more intrusive and complex than it used to be. You take trade. Trade is no longer simply about non-tariff barriers and reduction of tariffs. but it's increasingly about all manner of domestic policy choices. If you think about the inspection regimes, intrusive inspection regimes of something like the Chemical Weapons Convention, for instance, or the international regulations, health regulations of the World Health Organization, you find that, that everywhere getting global governance requires some significant sacrifices of domestic policy autonomy and sometimes external freedom of action. And this is very problematic, particularly in countries with volatile domestic politics. And in this case, democracy is no panacea. And in fact, democracy can often be a liability in terms of all this. So sovereignty is alive and well and kicking, even in Europe, it appears. And there are significant questions about how, as one creates these instruments, one retains these international instruments, one retains sufficient democratic sovereignty. So with those preliminaries, just in terms of at least the way I look at this problem and the way of framing the challenge of global governance, I want to invite our panelists to beginning with Sean, to offer some reflections on how they see the current global governance challenge. There are three issues that I'd love to cover, whether in their own comments or subsequently. One of them is how they see the current state of global governance and where the biggest gaps are and where the best prospects for sort of reform are. The second is whether they see rising and emerging powers as constituting a fundamental challenge to Western order, or simply as in a question of insisting on greater weight within reformed institutions. And the third question is, where will leadership in global governance come from? Is it going to come from the U.S. still? Is it going to come from China? Is it going to be absent? So those are just three questions. I have other ones too as well. But with those preliminaries, two long preliminaries, Sean, I'll turn it over to you and see whether or not you have would love to hear your thoughts.
Super.